welcome to all for a special interview with Dr. Howard Nicholas, making use of his visit to Sri Lanka. Let me put the interview in context. As you know, Sri Lanka Institute of Marketing is a national marketing body with over 40 years of excellence. And the theme of the current president is, current President One Gamage, is nation branding or country marketing, aimed at improving bilateral international relations. Sound nation marketing will help attract more investments, tourism, boost exports, and of course attract talent. In that context, we thought it is fitting to interview Dr. Howard Nicholas, who is well known in Sri Lanka as well as globally, and been a very passionate proponent of export-led industrial strategy, and we will hear more from him in terms of what Sri Lanka should be looking at in this overall country marketing. Let me introduce Dr. Howard Nicholas. Is an economist with extensive teaching experience in the area of business economics and financial markets, having taught these subjects for 40 years at the Institute of Social Studies, which is part of Erasmus University of Rotterdam, where he was awarded, interestingly, the Best Teacher Award for 10 consecutive years. And Howard is also been teaching lots of business schools as well as engage in training and writing books as well as articles. To start the discussion, Dr. Howard Nicholas, thank you very much for agreeing, accepting the invitation from SLIM. I want to ask Howard, in terms of given the current situation of need for foreign exchange, the global supply chain issues, and the need to boost reserves, there had never been a time where exports is the most important thing of late. So I just want you to sort of tell the audience here in terms of why should countries focus on export-less industrial strategy. And I know we have had lots of similar strategy in the past. In your answer, I just want to know what's the ideal strategy and what we need to sort of keep in mind in implementing that strategy.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Sri Lanka Institute of Marketing, for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor. It's wonderful to be back in Sri Lanka again after a long time away because of the COVID problem. And it's great to be here with you, Mr. Chatting again. I think we've done this quite a few times in the past. So it's really an old friend that I'm chatting to. And it's an important topic that you raise. And it's a crucial moment in Sri Lanka's history. I think this can't even be overstated. The starting point for me is, and I want to get away from these one-line Twitter exchanges which take place. I want to go to the fundamentals. So why export-oriented industrialization? I start with why industrialization, and then I pick up why exports. Why industrialization? 2 points. One is, as human beings, when incomes rise, we buy more manufactured items. I was recently reading a book by Richard Bryson, I think his name, or Bill Bryson, sorry, a famous American author, and he was describing the home. And there, what struck me is what he said 100 years ago. If you looked at the average household, and he was talking about, of course, the West, they had very few manufactured items in the house. So you'd have a table, a couple of chairs, you'd have a bed, maybe a wardrobe, but that's about it. If you go to any household, just go to a Colombo, an apartment somewhere in central Colombo, it's chock-a-block full of clothes dryers, washing machines, dishwashing machines, television sets, I can go on and on. Literally thousands of items in the household. These are all manufactured items. So the basic point is, as human beings have increased incomes, we buy more and more manufactured items. We don't buy more rice proportionately. We don't buy more vegetables. We don't actually purchase more services. We buy more and more manufactured items. So it's the first point to be made, is that the market is fundamentally for manufactured items. The second thing is that we have enough and more evidence to show that the countries that prosper, where income per capita, that is in relation to the population, rises, these countries have one thing in common, and that is product diversification. They produce more and more, but not of the same product, different products. And yes, we can produce different agricultural products, but it's always limited. It's always limited. Maybe Sri Lanka could even diversify into coffee, or organic tea, or organic vegetables, but it's limited. Whereas with manufactures, it's not limited. It lends itself to infinite diversification. And there's actually a beautiful chart done by the WTO, World Trade Organization, where on one axis they have per capita income, and on the other axis they have diversification. And there you can see the countries with the highest per capita income are the most diversified. And this seems peculiar because we're talking about countries like Switzerland, Singapore, and you wouldn't think these are diversified economies, but they are. They are. They're immensely diversified, fundamentally in manufactured items. So this is the second reason why we need industrialization, industrial development, manufacturing production. So these are the two basic reasons that I normally give. Then we ask ourselves, why exports? Some people say, why don't we concentrate on the domestic market? We call that import substituting industrialization. And the answer is very straightforward. The market of any developing country is limited. By definition, we are poor. The majority of people are poor. And if we want to seriously grow, we have to access markets where the money is. And this means exports. So we have a lot of experiences now of countries that have tried to go down this, we call it import substituting industrialization path. And they always end up with foreign exchange problems. And that's because domestic market is limited, and when they're producing manufactured items, they need to import. Where do they get the foreign exchange from? Usually what happens is they start to borrow more and more and more, but when you borrow, eventually you have to repay in foreign exchange. So they get into a crisis. And this is why only countries that have succeeded and continued in a sustainable manner are export-oriented countries. Now, this doesn't mean to say we should abandon agriculture or don't pay any attention to services. I'm not saying that. There are lots of services that we could promote which are foreign exchange earners, but it's not the core of our strategy. Generally, services are what we call derivative products, derivative of manufacturing production. And there, I take up one example because I hear it all the time. In fact, we were just discussing it before we started this interview, Singapore, So anytime I start any discussion, somewhere in the audience, there's a person whose brain has tuned into Singapore, and they say, oh, but what about Singapore? They developed on the basis of services. So by now, I am anticipating this question, and I have a whole country study of Singapore, showing that Singapore did not reinvent development. They went down the same path they're on today, and that is industrialization. For anyone who doesn't know what is happening in Singapore today, I can show them that Singapore has over 100 semiconductor companies. Not gigantic, but still over 100 semiconductor companies producing semiconductors. They're working with Foxconn, which is the largest in the world, and the second largest, Intel. And basically what has happened is they have a division of labor between them, and they're growing this industry massively. In other words, they've moved on from the manufacturers they started with, which was garments and low value added, into now really high value added because their salaries are so high. They can't be producing low value added manufactures. But Singapore hasn't abandoned manufacturing. It's the manufacturing base that attracted finance to come to Singapore in the first place. And we could go on about what manufacturers they started with, but I leave that for another discussion.
Thanks. Yes, before I go on to the second question, interesting observation in terms of the importance of industrialization. But Howard, currently by design or by default, services sector accounts for over 55% of GDP, Sri Lanka's GDP. Because of our strategic location, tourism, you name it. So I think the service sector is growing, and of course with becoming a logistics, aviation, shipping hub. Can we change the course now, or how should we sort of, whilst we are continuing to nurture the services sector and its potential? And I think even 55, there's some questions about, we must become a truly aviation hub, truly a shipping hub, logistics hub we've been talking about. You think Sri Lanka can really continue to go on that path, but also boost industrialization and exports?
Well, in a way, it's not either or, but let me start with this, that if I look at developing countries that haven't industrialized and have very low growth, economic growth, and are constantly in trouble in terms of their trade balance and reserves, these actually have gigantic service sectors. The usual number is at least 55 to 60%. That's the usual. The more failed the country, actually, the bigger the service sector. It's very normal that happens to failed economies. Now, even when you have a significant service sector like Sri Lanka does, if you just plot manufacturing against economic growth, you can see wherever manufacturing goes, growth follows, even with a very large service sector. And that is true of the whole world. So if I take the whole world and the whole economy of the world, services is by far the largest sector, by far. Manufacturing is about 25 to 30%. But if I do a plot of economic growth against growth of manufacturing, they're almost identical. If I plot growth against services or against agriculture, you can see they lag economic growth. The dynamic of the world has always been manufacturing. I mean, I'm going back now 400 years. Then I come to Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka's focus on services. Well, if we haven't gone down the industrialization path, people have to survive. They have to do something to survive. And Sri Lanka, of course, has tourism. And that is one of the survival strategies for very large numbers of people. Am I going to suggest, no, we now abandon tourism? No, on the contrary. And there I just want to give the example of Vietnam. People don't automatically associate Vietnam with tourism, unlike Sri Lanka and tourism. I mean, these are synonymous, But in fact, Vietnam has a huge tourist sector, which, just like Sri Lanka, got very badly damaged with COVID. What does Vietnam do? It also has this manufacturing dynamism. So what they did was they switched into the production of home office equipment during COVID. Contrast what happened to Sri Lanka's economy with what happened to the Vietnam economy. We collapsed. We ran out of reserves. We're in this terrible predicament. The opposite happened with Vietnam. Their tourism collapsed, but their manufacturing soared because they started producing home office equipment for the Western countries. Since they were in lockdown, everybody started working from home. The Vietnamese saw an opportunity, and my experience, and I've been there since 2012 and following the country very closely since this time, I've never seen reserves grow as they did during COVID. So this is a paradox, isn't it? I mean, here Sri Lanka loses reserves, and there Vietnam, while they had their tourism decimated, they've accumulated reserves like never before. In other words, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. You don't put all your eggs in the tourism basket, because apart from some international problems like this, we could also have political disturbances. I'm sorry to mention it because it's such a tragic scar for most people, the Easter bombings. You can always have political turmoil which immediately damages tourism. At the moment, it's not COVID which is damaging tourism. I mean, I've just been down the south coast and essentially the hotels are empty. Not because of COVID, but because we've run out of fuel. And this has transmitted all over the world, and now we're again caught in the same trap. So we have to diversify. And my study of things like IT, we really are not getting significant foreign exchange earnings. And there's no country in the world, even a country like India, they actually didn't make that much money from IT. And you're talking about the country with probably the largest IT sector in the developing world. And they now admit it. They admit that they went down the wrong path. They should have mixed it with production, and had production as the base. And this is why Modi was elected, because he did that in Gujarat, and now he's trying to spread it throughout India, where production now becomes the fundamental base, and then they use their IT sector in a complementary way.
You touched upon the import substitution may not work very well, but of late we have a government that has been championing import substitution, be it cement, pharmaceuticals, sugar, you name it, even including tiles. Now, one of the arguments to support import substitution is that to build this industrial base that you're talking about, you start building for local market or also look at export markets. Does that really help from an emerging nation, particularly when we haven't had a focused effort on industrialization?
Well, I have a certain ambivalence here on so I'm going to do the traditional economist thing on the one hand and the other hand, Forgive me, everyone, for doing so. But there are certain sectors and certain industries that do warrant some protection and nurturing, but with a view to making them more competitive, eventually liberalizing them. The problem is we can't do that with very many sectors. There are strategic sectors we may want to nurture and support, but it shouldn't be across the board. Now, when you have across the board import substituting strategy, you get this foreign exchange problem rearing its head. Plus, you get something else which is particularly damaging, and that is the lack of competition, the lack of cutting-edge technological change within that sector. This one thing that we have learned.
You mentioned about getting into a foreign exchange issue, but I think this government has been saying we need to go for import substitution to save foreign exchange because we are importing all these items. Can you explain how does that happen?
Yes, what happens is, so the proximate impact of going for import substitution is, well, we're basically substituting the imports. The problem is that we need to still import machinery, raw materials, and other inputs into what we're producing. And then the question arises, so where do we get the foreign exchange for that? We say, yes, we're saving, but it's actually a chicken and egg problem, because what often happens is that we usually have to borrow to supplement the foreign exchange, because we don't have this aggressive export-oriented strategy. So therefore, the foreign exchange often has to come from somewhere. The saving per se does not give you that foreign exchange. And what happens is the pie becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. So the import substituting strategies, they ended because of the foreign exchange problem. What they ended up doing to keep the expansion process going and not contraction, they ended up borrowing more and more and more. And it was usually government guaranteed loans, which the companies were benefiting from. However, in the final instance, they had to be paid back. And that's why we had default all over Latin America. Many Latin American countries tried the strategy, and default in sub-Saharan African countries. So this is the problem, is the foreign exchange block that occurs. Whereas the East Asians who went down the export-oriented industrialization strategy never had that block. It doesn't mean to say they didn't practice a lot of import substituting industrialization. They did. They protected a lot of their strategic industries, but they did it in the context of export orientation. I mean, you can see that China says it's liberalized and open for imports, but you can see in subtle ways the Chinese protect a lot of their industries. And that's the game that is being played by many, many countries. You know, you don't want to have a situation in which, remember today, you can't anyway block imports. I mean, this is not legal given all the treaties we have signed. But the game you have to play is actually allowing imports in freely, but supporting your domestic producers in ways that, let's say, do not fall foul of WTO regulation.
Howard, we talk about despite multiple efforts by successive governments, our exports still, manufactured exports only amounts to about $12 billion. Our import bill is about $21 billion. Since you're saying this path must be focused, how can Sri Lanka successfully come up with an export industrialization strategy? What would be your key checklist if a country is looking at implementing it, given our own legacies of being service? There is more attractiveness to go for more services, expand the service economy, and in that current context of import substitution, foreign reserves crisis, how should Sri Lanka take this strategy successfully?
Well, I think at the moment, Mr., we have a golden opportunity. I think it's now transparently obvious to everybody that we have to band together and go down this path of earning foreign exchange. If we just go with the begging bowl now and try and supplement our reserves with more loans, this problem that we have now is going to recur. I think virtually everyone now agrees. And therefore, the question you ask is really pertinent. What should we do? Now, in the old days, I would say, we have to get everyone together and draw up this plan and debate it and discuss it. In other words, wait for 10 years and, you and I would have retired and gone away and so on. This is the way we used to do this. But I've been having a front row seat in an industrialization process by a very pragmatic country, Vietnam. And what they do is they just start. They don't wait, they start. And they have an idea about all the complementary policies that need to be put into place, all the infrastructure that needs to be developed, the agricultural policies. They know all of that. They have an idea, but they know they must start now. And what they did was they said, okay, we have to get foreign investors to come, and not just any foreign investors. We want those who will start to help us get into modern manufacturing. What do I mean by that? Is they wanted now to start producing the goods that today's generation is buying. So they targeted smartphones. So when they started in 2012, still, the smartphone sector was in an embryonic stage. And what they did was they really hunted down some of the companies that they identified as being really important and also wanting to get out of China. So one of those companies was Samsung. Samsung wanted to relocate. Another was Intel. And so they targeted Samsung and they just started. And what they really wanted was to get that process underway where they're doing a joint venture, producing a commodity that they could then start to produce independently of Samsung. So they wanted the technology, and of course what they also wanted was Samsung's incredible market access. And that's what they went after. They didn't realize that a bonus also came with Samsung. Samsung decided that Vietnam's infrastructure needed upgrading to help their own logistics. So they put pressure on the Korean government to make concessional loans to the Vietnamese to develop their rail system and transport, the road transport system. And then when Vietnam started working with the Japanese, and here they started with various car companies. The Japanese car companies did the same thing. They put pressure on their government to give soft loans to Vietnam to build the infrastructure. The starting point was get the companies in. They didn't wait for, let's say, preparing the whole infrastructure, getting all the legislation sorted out, etc., etc. They didn't do that. They just went for it. And now, of course, they're doing more with the infrastructure, with agriculture, with a number of different areas which are necessary, including educational reforms. But that's what I think is the need of the day now in Sri Lanka. We've got to find a way to start. And there, Nista, we are in a current conjuncture which we will not see again. That is, it's a geopolitical environment where there's competition for the favors of developing countries like Sri Lanka. And we have the geographic location as well, which makes us a particular prize. Maybe in the past we were not such a big prize, but today we are. And now my suggestion is, even in the negotiations which are currently taking place for bilateral funds, don't go with just the begging bowl. Go and try and sell Sri Lanka, and this is to the slim people who are listening to me, to the marketeers who are listening to me, don't sell Sri Lanka as a tourist destination. Don't sell Sri Lanka even as a great transport hub. Sell Sri Lanka as a production base. This is going to make the difference going forward, and this is really important for us to do. So we're not just going with a begging bowl. We're saying, come to Sri Lanka, do business with us, because we're open to business. And that's where I think the business community does have a role to play. But maybe that's for another question down the line.
The usual, you're right in terms of, Sri Lanka over the years have been trying to, get consensus in policy and build this. So we have gone down that road, but there's always tendency to, even from the private sector, to object to some of these initiatives. Any liberalization, there's always a group that opposes. And with the ongoing IMF program, there is talk of reforms. Howard, my last question to you is, briefly, we also have a reforms challenge, and in what you suggested in the way forward, we will need to undertake reforms on the run. So how should any government approach that challenge?
Well, actually, my first line, my giveaway line is this: in a non-dogmatic manner, in a non-ideological manner, but rather a business manner. In other words, we are not for or against privatization. We are going to look and see, does privatization help our competitiveness as a country? Does it really help us reduce unit costs of production in Sri Lanka significantly? Because if it does, then we must go down that privatization path. But if it doesn't, we have to be very careful. And there are countries now paying that price for being ideological in one direction or the other. So I've given the example many times of a country like the United Kingdom going down the privatization path for ideological reasons, not because it actually improved the competitiveness of the economy, but rather because there's an ideological commitment to privatization per se. In other words, they're not really being pragmatic, and they're now paying the price heavily. The two examples that I've given, but there are actually many more. One is the railways. British Rail is a disaster. There's no other word to describe British Rail in the UK but a total unmitigated disaster, the result of ideological commitment to privatization. The more recent example, which is even admitted by the champion of precisely the policy of privatization of this particular institution, and that is airports. So airports in the UK were privatized but sold to one entity called British Airports Authority. And the champion, the one who wanted that privatization, one of them, was the Daily Telegraph. It's a very famous pro-business newspaper in the UK. But now, well, not now, but last year, I read an article where they admitted the average business person has an extra 45 minutes of waiting time because of the inefficiencies. You see, it's a monopoly. I don't need to do anything to improve my competitiveness, but it's damaging to the country. So this is the lesson for us in Sri Lanka, is we have to look at Sri Lanka as a company. Are we going to improve our competitiveness by this privatization or that? And that should be the focus of the discussion, not whether we are pleasing the international community or this one or that one. That is the East Asian way. That is the East Asian way, and that is what makes them successful because they're pragmatic about everything. If it can be made competitive, if it can be made cost efficient, we privatize. We don't have a problem with it. We don't have an ideological.
You touched on one part of reforms. What about public sector reforms? In the ease of doing business, there's lots of labor reforms and all that. How should Sri Lanka tackle that?
I think there are difficulties going forward, but one of the things that I have been trying to do in the time I've been here is actually show that there's a common interest of business and labor. There's actually a common interest of business, labor, and government, and that is again the success of the East Asian. You know, they don't have antagonistic approaches. Basically, labor has to realize that if Sri Lanka's export-oriented strategy works, we're going to talk of significant increases in salaries of everyone, wages of everyone. And yes, there are issues to be dealt with and discussions to be had, but there has to be that basic principle. You know, we have to get rid of the idea that the ultimate solution to the problem is a communist country or a socialist country. I mean, that is not, actually should not be there for a discussion and a debate. It doesn't mean to say that we should not protect social institutions which protect the welfare of people, that we don't pay a lot of attention to improving education and making it accessible for ordinary people. These are things we have to do. But what we have to do is overcome this unnecessary split between labor and business. You know, business people are always blaming labor, and labor are always blaming business. This is actually not very healthy for us going forward, because we're all going to benefit from this export-oriented liberalization strategy, because it's one ship. It's corporate ship Sri Lanka. And the more divided we are, the more problematic that strategy is going to be.
Thank you very much, Dr. Howard Nicholas, for that frank, candid assessment, including with some strong ideas in terms of how to get export-led strategy right. Key message to marketeers. I think we might have another discussion as to Howard's suggestion about position Sri Lanka as a country to do business as opposed to just only tourism. And I think there, in terms of while there are challenges to governments and politicians and private sector, I think Howard did mention about how everyone stands to gain if they work together as opposed then seeing as adversaries. So on behalf of Sri Lanka Institute of Marketing, I'd like to thank Dr. Howard Nicholas for your time and valuable insights. And we will hopefully continue to engage with you during your next visit as well. So thank you very much and all the best.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.